I'm absolutely thrilled that Dr. Charlton McIlwain has joined us today for the CCA 2021 keynote, How to Make Your Technology Anti-Racist. Dr. McIlwain is Vice Provost for Faculty Development and Engagement at New York University and Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU Steinhardt. His work focuses on the intersections of computing technology, race, inequality, and racial justice activism. He has served as an expert witness in landmark US federal court cases on reverse redlining, racial targeting, and mortgage lending, and recently testified before the US House Committee on Financial Services about the impacts of automation and artificial intelligence on the financial service sector. He writes regularly for outlets such as The Guardian, Slate's Future Tense, MIT Technology Review, and other publications about the intersections of race and technology. And McIlwain is the founder of the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies, heads NYU's Alliance for Public Interest Technology, and is NYU's designee to the Public Interest Technology University Network. Quite an esteemed guest we have here today, my fellow Canadian Communication Studies scholars. Furthermore, Dr. McIlwain is the author of the new book, Black Software, the Internet and Racial Justice, from the Afronet to Black Lives Matter, recently published by Oxford University Press. The book's contribution has been praised by innumerable scholars, and I'll mention a few of these accolades here. Dana Boyd, principal researcher, Microsoft Research, and founder of Data and Society, describes McIlwain's book as, quote, a poetic tour de force. By amplifying Black voices and their stories, McIlwain peels back a layer of overwritten history to reveal how technology and race have always been intertwined. This book's rhythmic drumbeat and call to action will energize your soul, end quote. Lisa Nakamura, Gwendolyn Calvert-Baker Collegiate Professor and Director of Digital Studies Institute, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, says, quote, McIlwain has written the first digital history book that explains in crystal clear terms exactly how big tech came to be an engine for inequality. Black Software is an utterly fascinating, painstakingly researched origin story of Black cyberculture. It will change the way you think about computers, fairness, racial identity, and America as a technological nation, end quote. Alondra Nelson, Harold F. Linder Professor of Social Science, Institute for Advanced Study, affirms that, quote, Black Software imaginatively reprograms late 20th century digital history with a revelatory account of the Black men and women who are its hidden figures. Unsung innovators are recovered as the forerunners of Black Lives Matter, Black Twitter, and Me Too in this detailed, creative, and crucial rendering of the tech communities that, against both the odds and countervailing forces, inspired today's hashtag politics, end quote. Well, congratulations, Dr. McIlwain, for research contribution that's clearly reverberating throughout the United States and around the world, and also connecting here in the Canadian Communication Studies Association as well. Indeed, your work and related scholarship has had an impact in Canadian communication studies and within this very conference, as indicated by the very significant and premier Communications So White panel series. So I'll give you some context for these series and actually Dr. McIlwain's presentation today. So in 2018, Dr. McIlwain, along with Paula Chakravarty, Rachel Koh, Victoria Grubbs, published a significant article called Hashtag Communications So White in the Journal of Communication that shed light on how, quote, racial inequalities and colonial legacies of white supremacy permeate scholarly and public discussions today, and then called for the decentering of, quote, a white masculinity as the normative core of scholarly inquiry, end quote. Then in 2020, Canadian Communication Studies researchers, Drs. Faiza Herji, Yasmin Jawani, and Kirsten Emiko McAllister published On the Margins of the Margins, Hashtag Communications So White, Canadian Style. So we see this really interesting internationalization of this incredibly significant work and making resonance within our own scholarly association, as indicated by the wonderful panels over the past few days on this very topic. And at present, Drs. Herji, Jawani, and McAllister are editing a new special issue of the Canadian Journal of Communication entitled On the Margins of the Margins, Racism and Colonialism in Canadian Communication Studies. So we were intending to meet at last year's annual Canadian Communication Studies Conference, But as we know, the pandemic sent in, basically emerging, canceling many things, including our annual conference last year that was set to take place at the University of Western, and indeed, unfortunately and sadly, canceling Charlton's keynote at that point. In this regard, we're absolutely delighted. We are so pleased to be together in the shared virtual space today with you, Charlton, and we're so grateful that you've chosen to rejoin us this year to present how to make your technology anti-racist. So without further ado, let's give a warm virtual welcome or clap with the hand clap signal to Dr. Charlton McIlwain.
Thank you, and Tanner, thank you so much for that introduction and welcome. It's great and was great to get your message earlier in the year, to get the re-invitation given the fact that we had to unfortunately cancel last year's events and plans. So it's absolutely great to be back with you. And I appreciate the introduction along with the land acknowledgements and so forth, and I think sets the perfect tone for today's talk. And also, I have to admit, I'm prone to tangents. So the more that you gave context for this, the more I wanted to sort of dive in and explore so many things that you brought up by way of introduction. And maybe we'll have a little chance for tangents somewhere along the way. Anyway, and I think that in some ways, and in a good way, it's good to be here now, even having to have canceled last year's event. I can't recall if we had gotten up to the point of having a title and advertising the name of the talk and so forth last year before we had to cancel, but I can say as much as this, which is today's talk is something very, very different than what would have been a year ago. Both given the events that have unfolded across the world over the year in terms of the pandemic, but also in terms of the impact of that pandemic and multiple pandemics as we talk about communities of color around the world and the ways in which the pandemic, in many respects, helped to lay bare yet again the massive inequalities, the disparate outcomes that fall along racial and other lines across much of the world. And this has, of course, had a profound effect when we think about the question of technology and what that looks like, both in terms of our past, but also in terms of our future. The year's also given me an opportunity to talk with a lot of folks and engage about the subject of the book, Black Software. And it's interesting as time has emerged and as the book has come out and talking and engaging with communities about its subject matter and themes and so forth, to hear what people are interested in, to hear what questions people have, to hear what galvanizes people in terms of the tone and direction of conversation. And I will say that it tends to be, for those of you or any of you that have had the opportunity to read Black Software, know that it is organized as two books, both of which are tied together, but have very different narratives. One that is very much about the more recent past and about Black pioneers of the internet and of digital media, and looking at the ways in which Black folks have made their mark in many ways on our digital history, on our technological history. The second part of that book goes back even further into that history and talks about some of the things that I think are more, in some ways more important, some ways more significant, in some ways more novel in terms of what we know or what we have known about the history of technology, the history of civil rights, the history of racism and discrimination. And the interesting thing over the last year is that I find more often than not that folks really love the stories about what is book one in the book, the more recent history. And today gives me an opportunity, I think, to, in a very constructive way, talk more about the other part of that book, that history, and bring it into conversation with our present around this question, how to make our technology anti-racist. And so I want to start a little bit by just giving a little bit of background about the book so that folks have a somewhat of an understanding of the lens I bear to or bring to this question about anti-racist technology and what that means and what that looks like, and then get into the talk more formally. And then, of course, I really look forward to our time for Q&A and discussion on many of the topics that we, of course, won't have a chance to cover in the course of the talk itself. Black Software began as a fairly straightforward attempt for me to try to understand what was going on in the US and what had spread to and beyond the US in 2014, 15, and 16, and that was the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I was particularly interested in, of course, the digital underpinnings of that movement, the ways that activists and others utilized the digital affordances to really push for social justice and to really accomplish a lot of things that had not been accomplished literally in about 50 years of our history, at least here in the United States. And so I was interested in both how that happened, the ways in which our technology were engaged to help make that happen. But I was also interested in the digital roots of these movements as well, knowing that powerful movements like these don't emerge from nowhere with people who just step onto the scene. And so I was interested in where Black Lives Matter came from, both in terms of the people who were leading it, but also in terms of the media environments in which it took place. And that was a start, I should say, to a long series of conversations that drastically transformed my idea of what this book, what Black Software was going to be and what it ultimately turned out to be. The more folks that I had the opportunity to talk to, the more, number one, I got pushed further and further back into history. That history was initially back into the early and mid 90s, which was somewhat expected given the dawn of the internet as we know it, taking form and taking shape in the early 90s. But as I talked to some of the early pioneers of the internet, Black pioneers of the internet, I began to hear stories that went back into the 80s and into the 70s, and ultimately allowed myself to get back to the 1960s to try to understand where this story began, or at least one beginning of this story about the relationship that Black people have had with computing technology beginning in the early 1960s. And that, for me, I should say, was at the very beginning a scary turn of events. I'm a social scientist. I am not a historian by training and most of my career, but this book turned out to be a historically written book, a very narrative heavy book telling a story about and that connected multiple decades that ultimately went to answer another question, a different one than I had started off trying to answer. So that question became less about Black Lives Matter and where it came from and how it got started and the digital media and technology that underpinned it, and more to that broader question that I spoke of about what has been and what was the relationship between African Americans and computing technologies from a time in which these two moments, these two revolutions, one in civil rights and in and around racial justice, and the other around the computer revolution, were happening at the same time. And of course, what little had been written at the time had really said that these moments were running parallel. And so that you had the 60s civil rights movement going on one hand, the computer revolution emerging on the other, but that these were parallel things that only had one thing in common, and that was the time and moment of history in which they were playing out. And so the discovery that really changed the trajectory of Black software was about the ways in which that narrative was absolutely incorrect, and the ways in which issues of race, racism, racial discrimination, and civil rights, and the rise of the computing revolution were in many ways one and the same, that they were intimately engaged with each other and helped to shape one another. And that's largely what I want to speak about and forms the foundation and context for what I want to talk about today, which is, of course, a question that I started to get asked more and more over the last year, which was, tell us or tell me not so much more about how we got into the situation that we're in, but how do we get out of it? What is the future, and how can we imagine a different future in terms of our technology, in terms of race, than what we have been through and what has led us to this point? And so that is the frame for this question that I want to talk about today, about anti-racist technology. And I want to start this conversation with an excerpt from the book, an excerpt from the introduction of the book that I think frames in a very real way the concept of anti-racist technology in my formulation, and gives us a sense of its imperative. And this is a question I used to begin the book. And of course, for those of you who have read it, know that somewhat of the same question is how I leave off the close or the end of the book as well. Here's the quote. In between these two versions of Black software lies a most significant question. That question is not about recently popularized concepts like computer bias, fair algorithms, platform inequality, or digital ethics. No, this question goes to the heart of the matter that these concepts merely skirt around. And that question is this: will our current or future technological tools ever enable us to outrun white supremacy? After all, this is not just our country's founding principle, it is also the core programming that preceded and animated the birth, development, and first uses of our computational systems. And so I know one of the speakers for this year's Congress at one of the events was Ibram X. Kendi, whose recent book outlines how to be an anti-racist. And as we pick up this same theme and set of concerns in the realm of technology, I think it is important, first of all, to recognize that in varying forms and using different vocabularies, folks like Ruha Benjamin and Sophia Noble, Simone Brown, Lisa Nakamura, Alondra Nelson, Margaret Hugh, Moya Bailey, Sarita Amruti, Kishana Gray, Desmond Patton, Catherine Steele, Andre Brock, Minna Pham, Wendy Chun, Alyssa Richardson, Rashida Richardson, and many, many others have long been interrogating and writing about anti-racist technology, by which I mean technologies that not only diminish the scourge of racism and white supremacy, but technologies that are imagined, developed, and used to affirm the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, if you will, by and among people and communities of color. And so with that realization, I want to focus today on defining, if you will, or at least outlining what I see as the necessary and sufficient conditions in which we can conceptualize what anti-racist technology looks like, and how we can begin to address the question, so many people in both the technology communities and lay communities are beginning to ask, which is how can we make our technology explicitly anti-racist? So despite the fact that this question is being articulated in this way, from educators teaching about technology to technologists at private companies who are building new technologies, to policymakers trying to understand whether and how we should regulate them, it is clear from early evidence that our efforts to define and develop so-called anti-racist technology are already heading off track. Some initiatives that I have seen want to promote anti-racist technology by changing the workplace cultures in tech companies, while others focus on delimiting elements of unconscious bias within individual employees at tech companies and elsewhere. Other initiatives target and produce and make accessible varying forms of information, or seek to correct racially problematic language. For instance, like the master-slave language used to define historically the relationship between hardware and software systems, just as one example. But this being one method of pursuing or promoting what folks are beginning to call anti-racist technology. And so while all of these are laudable, and I don't want to diminish the significance of their efforts, I do think that in many ways, they reflect our widespread misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what racism is in the first place. And so I want to begin with the observation that we can't simply reduce anti-racist technology to technologies that merely impact or regulate individual behavior or ways of thinking, or even to ameliorate forms of quote unquote bias. While having a more representative tech workforce is necessary, I think, anti-racist tech should not become synonymous with corporate makeovers, nor can they be isolated applications or products that are disconnected from specific systems or structures that produce racial inequalities. Anti-racist technology must be targeted. It must impact structures and have systemic reparative impacts at the scale in which racial discrimination has historically disaffected people of color. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. And so I think if we're going to proceed with a working definition of what anti-racist technology is, we have to start, or at least I like to start, by defining clearly what I mean by racism itself. And I have a very simple, or at least concise, definition of what that is. And that is, racism is a system of institutions and institutional practices that structurally and systematically produce disparate advantages, disadvantages, privileges, and power along racial lines. Let me repeat that again. Racism is a system of institutions and institutional practices that structurally and systematically produce disparate advantages, disadvantages, privileges, and power along racial lines. And as we will see, as we continue to talk about what anti-racism or what anti-racist technology is and should look like, it all comes back to and is consistent with this basic definition. A starting point for me for framing not only what anti-racist technology is, but how we can imagine, design, and build and deploy technologies that are anti-racist. And so the first step to making our technology anti-racist is, I think, the most important one. And it is to deeply understand how our technologies and technological infrastructure became racist in the first place. And I can't underscore this point enough. So many people, well-meaning, well-intentioned, are eager to design anti-racist technologies of the future, but have very little insight into how our technological past and present has been shaped by the same systemic and structural dynamics that have made all of our institutions fundamentally racist, fundamentally anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-Latina, Latinx, anti-Chicana, anti-Asian, anti-immigrant, and many others that we could line up behind that. And so when I think about how technology has been designed to sustain and reproduce racism and white supremacy, I recall a number of events, moments, happenings that help to exemplify this. I remember, for instance, idealistic white MIT students who tried to align and organize with the Black freedom struggle back in 1960. I recall that they quickly lost their way less than just a year later. I remember the Watts riots in Los Angeles here in the United States in 1965, a powder keg that was touched off by the scourge of persistent police brutality. I remember IBM, a company at the time positioning itself to solve the kinds of complex problems that revealed themselves on those South Central Los Angeles streets. How to communicate across vast geographical distances to contain threatening Black violence and destruction. I remember back, and my mind goes back to IBM's president, Tom Watson Jr., who explained at the time that IBM's mission was to, quote, solve problems as they may exist in business, science, defense, education, medicine, space exploration, and other areas. I remember the United States President, Lyndon Johnson at the time, and his ensuing war on crime. The urban Black and brown citizens, the face of white America's imagined crime problem. And I remember the Science and Technology Task Force that Johnson called into being to solve us. That is, to solve that crime problem that was presented as in a Black face. Again, this was back in 1965, and I remember, and fast forward through the end result of that commission, the billions of dollars that the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration doled out like candy canes at Christmas time to incentivize building technological fixes to our so-called crime problem. I remember Alert 2, the first fully functioning criminal justice information system that debuted in Kansas City, Missouri, in the aftermath of the turmoil that followed the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Systems, by the way, that even in 1968, when they were first functional, were the state of the art and lured law enforcement from places as far as China and as close as Canada to the United States to see the new technological wonders that were going to come to bear on the new law enforcement that was put into place. These systems proliferated from the early 60s throughout the 1960s and 70s to become the United States surveillance infrastructure, an infrastructure that, of course, goes well beyond this country's borders. The predictive policing, racial profiling, facial recognition technologies, and similar systems that racial justice activists and communities of color face and battle against today. I remember Thursday, August 6, 1965, the day that President Lyndon Johnson signed a very important piece of legislation, the Voting Rights Act. But I'm really reminded about something that very few people talk about, and that was something not at all known to me, and I suspect many others, even scholars and historians of US history. Earlier in that same week that this historic piece of civil rights legislation was signed, a man named W. Willard Wirtz, who was Lyndon Johnson's labor secretary, had just earlier that week, on that Monday, took to the pages of what was his weekly Labor Department newsletter. In it, he read or had written a headline in bold letters that said, "Head-on collision course for civil rights and automation. Wirtz wrote, call it automation or cybernation or age of the robots. The technological revolution is here and here to stay. Call it civil rights or equal opportunity or peaceable protest for freedom now. It is equally evident that the Negro Revolution is here, he said. And so it was interesting to me to discover that Wirtz had recognized early on that there was even a relationship between the exploding computing revolution in the early 1960s and the Black civil rights struggle. Until recently, as I mentioned earlier, most of our history is written either about the history of computing or the history of civil rights, said nothing of this relationship. But Wirtz continued in his newsletter to say something else that I think was even more prescient about this relationship, this evolving relationship between Black folks and other people of color in the United States and the burgeoning computer industry. He said there are machines now which can play excellent games of checkers, and they can play a pretty good game of chess. They can play a fair hand of bridge. They can interpret books. They are doing a good many ways, skilled as well as unskilled jobs in the economy. They have no hands, but they can tabulate checks, and they make no mistakes. They have no eyes, and yet they watch over the industrial process without ever blinking. And it has taken only 30 years to move from the fantasy of Rossum's universal robot to the reality of UNIVAC and its brother computers. And today's reality is more fantastic than the fiction of the 1920s. And so there in the early 1960s, the man who headed this country's national labor force articulated both the present and future of what we now know or could call artificial intelligence, whether we call them robots or thinking machines or learning machines or predictive modeling or automated systems or other terms that we could or could be very well synonymous. At the dawn of the computing era, Wirtz was already pointing out that the present and future of computing technology was not just separated on two different tracks, but destined for a collision with civil rights, a collision that would leave one standing and the other mangled and decimated. But under the surface, Wirtz's words signaled much more than a concern that new automated computing technologies would overtake Black people and other people of color in the workforce. His words also connoted Black deficiency in both intelligence and skills, and this perception about Black inferiority defined that early relationship between Black people and computing at this very critical moment of technological development. These deep perceptions about Black inferiority and white superiority would have, of course, devastating consequences for how we would imagine, design, and build the new technologies that in 1965 would turn into today's ubiquitous technology infrastructure, one that continues to actively police, surveil, resist, and work against Black people and other communities of color, and our collective efforts to promote racial equity. And so when I think about how technology, again, has been designed to sustain and reproduce racism and white supremacy, I'm also reminded of the words of a congressman and civil rights activist named Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who in 1960 proclaimed this to a collective group of the NAACP, a national civil rights organization. He said, "I shall not quote statistics. To do so would be a waste of my time or your time and that of my staff. We know that the Afro-American is the last hired, first fired. We know that he pays a tax on being Black, which makes him the lowest wage earner in this nation. We know that he is quarantined, regardless of ability and education, so that his highest achievement can be the attainment of only creature comforts. We know that he composes the largest number of unemployed in this nation today. And we know that this new era of automation does not include him. Finally, when I think about how technology has been designed to sustain and reproduce racism and white supremacy, I'm reminded of a time, and of course I'm skipping fast forward in time by decades when I mention this, but I'm reminded of a time when the internet was Black, when it was teeming with Black people, entrepreneurs, activists, content creators, community organizers, and more. A brief moment in time in the mid and late 1990s when Blackness thrived on the web and Black people were recognized for and profited from the cultural capital that they had built and brought legions and legions of new users to a new medium that had, at that time, of course, relatively few. And I'm reminded that today, Blackness and Black cultural production still animate the web and its platforms. But those who dominate and own these spaces have become content to capitalize on Black culture while foreclosing the ability for Black people to profit from our own work in significant ways. I belabor this point, that is the point that deeply understanding how technology's racist past is a precondition for imagining and making an anti-racist future for a reason. I'm all for moving forward. I'm all for thinking about the future, but in many respects, this is where I believe we need to live for a while. This is the dirt, the mud, the sinkholes, the mud pits we need to immerse ourselves in and wallow in. In our extremely presentist and short-term future orientation with which we like to approach technology work, it's easy to ignore the past or even forget that a past exists when it comes to this connection between race and racism and between technology. But we are naive if we think that we can achieve an anti-racist technological future if we do not first confront deeply, significantly, our technological history, our racist past, which of course are one and the same. So that first point was a long one, and I have several others. And so I'll continue to say second, that anti-racist technology not only confronts our racist technological past, but anti-racist technology must also address a specific systemic and structural racial problem. Let's take, for example, an area that I've had the opportunity to be immersed in quite a bit, and that is an example in housing discrimination in the United States. A long history of discriminatory policies by banks, insurance companies, real estate brokers deny Blacks and other people of color a fair shot at the so-called American dream of home ownership, and have done so historically. Redlining, blockbusting, racial zoning, restrictive covenants, racial steering, these and other practices are what have helped to concentrate economic wealth and political power into the hands of a very few white people and white communities, while denying people and communities of color those same opportunities. And so to say that anti-racist technology must also address a specific systemic and structural racial problem means that anti-racist technology can't be a diffuse or abstract in either concept or execution. That is, it must be targeted, it must be focused on identifying, mitigating the disparate racial outcomes of, or ameliorating a specific set of systemic racial problems. Third, anti-racist technology must also target and engage the specific institutions that have jurisdiction over producing particular racially discriminatory outcomes. Sticking with our same example in the realm of housing, this would mean, for example, and this is not an exhaustive list, but engaging the institutions of advertising, including ad tech, real estate brokerage, banking, financial services, insurance and underwriting, consumer protection agencies, and the courts, just to name a few. And we'll come back to all of these in just a minute and kind of recap in a kind of holistic way some of these examples and how it manifests in this sense of thinking about anti-racist technology and what that may look like. But fourth, I should say, anti-racist technology must also address one or more of the structural domains associated with these institutional problems. Again, in this example, this would include the process by which one secures a home mortgage, which includes the advertising and outreach, again, the search for a home, the search for a mortgage, pre-applying for that mortgage, the process of loan approval or denial, loan administration, underwriting, and more. Fifth, anti-racist technology must address and ideally ameliorate some aspect of the differential treatment and or disparate racial impacts that are routinely part of the process, which again in this example includes things such as racially discriminatory real estate steering, differential decisions about qualifications, price discrimination in terms of the appraisal value of homes, mortgage interest, closing costs, etc. Differential treatment on the administration of loan payments, defaults, foreclosures, and how all of those things are handled. I want to take just one moment, if you'll bear with me, to share my screen and share just one slide. So here, I just wanted to briefly illustrate some of the points that I was mentioning about anti-racist technology in the context of a very specific racial problem. And so here we see illustrated this problem focusing on housing discrimination in the United States. And so the point I want to make is that when we think about anti-racist technology in the ways that I am thinking about them, it is not, again, a sort of abstract concept or a concept or technology or set of applications that we can think of that are singular in nature or disconnected from very specific problems, issues, institutions, and otherwise. And so what I've done and what you see here is a kind of mapping out of the structure of the process of home ownership or trying to secure mortgage for home ownership here in the United States. And you see bolded the three elements that I've highlighted in some of my recent points, which are the structural domains. And so this outlines very specific aspects of the process that one goes through to apply for and to get a mortgage, beginning with advertising and outreach, pre-application period of time, the process of applying for a mortgage and going through loan approval or denial, questions about terms, conditions, then assuming that one gets a loan, the stage of loan administration and so forth. And so those are the varying domains that one progresses through during the course of applying for securing a mortgage. When we look at this next column, we are looking at the varying institutions that are in some way responsible for or associated with each of those structural domains. And so again, in this case, this includes, and this is not an exhaustive list, as I said, but advertising and ad tech, when we think about advertising and outreach, also thinking about real estate brokerage and a very long historical system in which that particular profession and system works. As we get to pre-application inquiries and applying for the loan, institutions of banking, financial services, insurance, underwriting, and appraisal, and so on and so forth. You can go down the list. And then in this third column with the highlighted text above, the varying ways in which differential treatment or disparate impacts based on race become potentially part of this process facilitated by the institutions that are involved and facilitated through each of the structural domains in which one progresses on the way towards getting a mortgage. And so my point is simply this, that when we think about what anti-racist tech is or what it might be or what it might look like in application or in actuality, the point I want to emphasize is that that tech has to connect in some meaningful way to these structures that undergird the racial problems that are the outcomes, the different outcomes that are often seen based on race. And we could talk about that some more in the Q&A. Lots of detail here that we don't have time to get to. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen there and continue, but hopefully wrap up here in just a few, but would love to come back to that during the Q&A. And so the sixth and final point that I want to make about anti-racist technologies, and the questions have to be different. That is, when we think about all of those things I had mentioned about being connected to institutions, about focusing on a very specific problem, so on and so forth, as we come to an end, I think that almost as significant as point number one, which is really deeply interrogating, engaging with our history of race and technology, is beginning to see and having the ability to ask ourselves and to ask of our technology, frankly, very different questions. And so thinking about the ways in which in our current context, in our future context, how we can ask that technology help us not to do what we've asked it to do in the past, which is how to maintain power and the status quo and how to identify and destroy anything that would threaten the system as it now exists. And in many ways, those were the very explicit questions that were asked of the technology, as it were, that really animated a lot of the first uses, as I mentioned earlier, of our computational systems that were very much framed around how do we keep in place our current political, social, economic power relationships that, of course, maintains white dominance and the subservience of all other groups. And so these questions were very real, they were very deliberate, and I think one of the things that I was so struck by as I moved in and through this history that's very different from, of course, today, are the ways in which 50, 60 years ago, these intentions, these motivations were out in the open. No one was trying to hide them. The racial problems, the threats that were seen by those who were in positions of power were very real, very explicit. And when it came time to think about the ways in which technology, new technologies at the time, could help deal with these new perceived problems, those motivations as well were very clear, not hidden behind walls of simple bias or anything else that may have governed those things. And so what I think that we have to do if we're going to be serious about asking ourselves, how can we have anti-racist technology? We've got to be able to ask ourselves different questions. And I think we have to have questions that are framed in the way that another civil rights pioneer in the United States framed his question, that I think was a most significant one, in an editorial in 1968 that was titled "Computerize the Race Problem." And so what I want to do in these last few minutes is to do something I rarely do in these talks, or try to push myself not to do, which is to read a significant portion of a text, but This editorial by Roy Wilkins in 1968 is one of the texts that I come back to over and over again as I give these talks, because I think both the context that he provided and then the question that he poses at the end of this editorial are in many ways the exact type of question we need to be able to see ourselves asking today if we are going to, again, think about how we conceptualize and really apply and call into being what we might term anti-racist technology. And Roy Wilkins was a unique human being, and the unique human being in terms of his upbringing, in terms of his work. And it was probably in part his early capacity for engineering, which he started off his career aspiring to be an engineer. And it's likely this that motivated him to, over the course of time throughout the 1960s and early 70s, deeply contemplate the computer revolution's meaning for Black people in the United States. And perhaps it was only someone who had witnessed firsthand both the racial violence and hope that he could, as he had in his past, simultaneously transpose a deep sense of both optimism and pessimism onto the computer. If nothing else, it certainly was his journalist education and longtime editorial work are what allowed him to so adroitly frame the deeply probative question, a question that I think exemplifies a countervision to that one that we heard earlier that was articulated by Labor Secretary Willard Wirtz. In the headline of his September 11, 1967 LA Times editorial, he conjectured, computerize the race problem. The news that computers are now fashioning the ideal Holstein Friesian milk cow sets the mind working on facets of our ever irritating race problem. Critics of Booker T. Washington often remarked that he was teaching Negroes hand craftsmanship at the very time that such skills were falling before the onrush of the machine. Today, the Negro, still largely in the unskilled category, faces automation and the computer. The computer's work with the world's favorite black and white cow suggests that the race is about to fall farther behind than ever. The Negro's realization that he is confronted with a danger, one not completely understood, but threatening on all sides, may account in part for his present mood of belligerence. It may be one of the bases for the retreat of more emotional elements into the familiar and relatively comforting areas of Blackness. What would you do if you and your family had been farming cotton all your lives and all too suddenly a mechanical method of weeding came along, followed by a mechanical cotton picker? If these disasters were but preludes to absentee ownership, consolidation of acreage, and diversification of crops, the chances are the sharecropper family would find itself in a strange urban community, hunting a job, a house, and a school. For the Negro former farm worker, the computer is but one more signal that he has been kept at arm's length, while the rest of America pressed forward into the computer era. In the mass, he never got a chance to acquire the learning and the skills which would have enabled him to progress toward the use of data processing. He was not without ambition and initiative, but whenever he tried to move, he was slapped down. In 1910, for example, Arkansas Negro sharecroppers in Phillips County had their meeting shot up. When they shot back, the state militia began killing Negroes at will under the guise of suppressing an insurrection. It was not intended that these Black farmers should be permitted to take even the first step towards better farming and bigger earnings. And right there is where the American system of individual enterprise and reward on the basis of ability broke down. It is precisely at this point and thousands of family histories that the difference between opportunities for the unskilled white immigrant and those for the unskilled Black American became manifest. When I look now into the skeptical eyes of bewildered white observers of this riotous summer, I think of Arkansas sharecroppers, of Anthony Crawford, who was a Negro farm worker, lynched because he was too prosperous, of the Negro families, who wore their old clothes to town in order to offer no disturbing comparison with those of white folks. No, all Negroes have not been shiftless or without ingenuity or the will to get ahead. The hardiest have advanced despite obstacles and have fought and paid for opportunity for their children. But many scores or thousands who now should be giving the overwhelming answer to the question of Negro ability were hobbled and crushed in spirit. The psychological children of this treatment are the 1967 rioters. Near relatives are their embittered but non-riotous supporters. And here comes the question, and I'm going to, because we're already over time of what I hope to be speaking, I'm going to close with this question that he posed at the end of this editorial, and thinking about the ways in which it connects and shapes to our connects to our present moment, and should shape the way in which we think about what we might call anti-racist technology that requires an utterly different way of asking questions, both of ourselves, but also of the technological applications, enterprises, infrastructures that we may build. After the computer has defined on tape the ideal Holstein, could it then turn its impersonal, unprejudiced magic upon our agonizing race problem? Could it not, after digesting the facts, which both whites and Blacks have fogged over for so long, give us an outline of our obligations? Instead of being a measure of the Negro's lag, cannot the computer become a guidepost to interracial justice and peace? So with that, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions, your comments, and the discussion for the rest of the time that we have together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlton. A warm round of virtual applause for the keynote. I'm seeing many hands virtually clapping. That was wonderful. There's so much to think about there. And I know that CCA members will have a lot of questions and probes. So thanks very much. So we have about 25 minutes, I see, remaining in today's keynote session for the question and answer period. And the way I'd like to moderate the question and answer period is to invite CCA members to just type question in the chat bar. And what I'm going to do is create a speakers list. And I think what we can do is take one question at a time. And then if there's follow-ups based upon the response, you can type follow-up in the chat bar, and I'll know exactly that you're following up on the response to your question. Try to keep your questions or comments brief and concise so maximal number of people can engage and participate. So I already see here a question by Ushnis Sengupta. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question, Ushnis. And I welcome everyone else also, if you want to turn your videos on and show that sense that we're kind of virtually together, you're welcome to do that as well. Okay, Ushnis, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. McIlwain, for your presentation. My question is, I bring in these issues of power and race and gender and so on into my courses, but in the end, my students want to work for big tech companies. And I feel like I'm competing between teaching critical skills and student financial interest. And I feel particularly guilty raising that kind of issue when the student is like first generation, racialized and so on, that wouldn't maybe get a chance to work in a company like that at that salary and maybe in the past. So I was wondering if you had any advice.
Thank you for that question. I love it. It's the one I think about a lot. I will tell you what my typical response is, particularly to those students of color that are going to work in those companies, and that is do it. Go make the money. These are opportunities that I think that they have to have in order to further that critical sensibility about technology. I think it's the kind of pathway that they have to follow to gain, or at least start to approach the kind of financial security that is necessary to really engage these questions of power, of discrimination, and thinking about how to change. And I think that, for me, it's been a wonderful way to think about the imperative and responsibility for me as an educator to say, here are students who are going to go into the belly of the beast, as it were. And what I want them to be able to do is to get there and be able to have a sense of autonomy, self-determination, and a sense in which they can influence the circumstances and contexts in which they're in. I'm not a believer that all change has to come from the outside and pressure. I think there has to be fundamentally some sense of change within those organizations. And so I think the two work hand in hand, that ideally they get the kind of critical education and sensibilities from the folks like us who are attuned to them, so that they can go into those spaces, learn, and figure out for themselves when that right moment is to make a different turn, and maybe to stick with the organization as their place to make change, or particularly in their first few years, not even to have to carry that burden of change on themselves, and think about what their level of social and economic advancement could be. And I think they deserve that opportunity and right.
Thank you. Do I have another question or comment from the audience? Don't be shy.
The fewer questions there are, the longer my answers are going to become.
Okay, great. I'm starting to get a speakers list. So first Penelope, and then Nathan. Oh, actually, I see Kirsten as well. So let's start with Kirsten, and we'll go to Penelope and Nathan. Welcome, Kirsten.
Okay, Dr. McIlwain, thank you so much. Really powerful research and so informative about at so many levels. So I wanted to ask you more of it's a bit of an abstract question, I guess. So bear with me. I was really intrigued by your statement about we have to learn how to a different way of asking questions. So that's a huge shift in the mind, like the apparatus of the mind in our field. So what is it that's limiting now about the way we ask questions? Because you really emphasize that. And what are you cracking open in terms of epistemologically and politically by that intervention?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think in a lot of ways, what I hope to do by posing that kind of statement is to think about our relationship to a very strong, intense technology infrastructure that I think was set in motion by a set of questions that animated and motivated people at a very particular time. And the answers to those questions became, over these last 50, 60 years, the tech infrastructure that we see. And so part of this is a way of thinking about agency. It's something that I struggle with a lot, because when you see, and it's one of the things that I hope in a talk like this, I really want to point out, which is it's easy to talk about anti-racist technology and think about making anti-racist technologies, but to come face to face with the fact that we have an established infrastructure that is so difficult to undo, to unravel, to disentangle. But indeed, that's what we have to do. And so it becomes difficult sometimes to see that there is a level of agency in that mix. That is, that we have some ability to make significant change and untangling that and putting us on a very different course. And so the question and the idea about thinking of different questions really is one that I'm hoping will get to how do we begin to unravel this infrastructure? How do we begin to imagine what might look different when we've only seen something that is very monolithic for the last 50, 60 years, that is a tech infrastructure that delivers outcomes that perpetually discriminates against and disadvantages the same people and groups of people time and again. And so the question is really one, I think, about agency and about a starting point. And I think that starting point, we so often want to rush to, let's make something, particularly when I'm with my computer science students or folks like that. Well, let's build something, let's make something, let's engineer something. And part of me wants to say, well, step back. What's animating what it is you hope to build? What's the question that you hope to answer? And I'm hoping that the framing of that question has to do more with something that is open and approaching these ideas about justice that are vastly different than the ones that animated these first questions that built or pushed this initial tech infrastructure that we have in place.
So it's cracking the future that's been determined by these questions as technologies in a way. Anyway, thank you for posing that. Yeah.
Thank you, Kirsten. Okay, next up we have three more questions. First with Nathan. Nathan, welcome.
Thanks, Tanner. And thanks so much, Charlton. I'm just buzzing from all this. I'm wondering, does your subtle, nuanced schematic of what anti-racist technology is also subtly backdoor a schematic of what racist technology is, as it's kind of its obverse, like all the things it's pushing up against? Does that negative space define maybe how you see racist technology?
Yeah, thanks for that. It very well does, and I'm glad you see the subtleties there. For me, it's quite obvious because I often say my imagination is quite limited, and so it's easy. It has been easy, or not easy, I should say. It's been kind of the first place my mind goes, and has gone several years when I first started working and thinking in this area. That is, if we're to think about something different, in some ways, it probably maps onto what got us here into the first place. And so at least as a starting point, thinking about anti-racist technology maps onto the systems of racism that produced our current situation. And so finding those analogs, and that has a lot to do with that sort of mapping that that visual that I put on the board, which was how do we see, or how has historically racial inequality, racial discrimination been produced in terms of our configurations of space, and particularly our configurations of space in the sphere of home ownership, residential segregation, things of that nature. And then using that as an analog to think about, well, if these are implicating certain institutions, certain types of practices that are inherent in that particular situation, along with a very long history of codified disparate racial impacts, then perhaps flipping it on its head gives at least some way to how do we emerge from this. And I think that's where that imperative comes from for me, of wanting to focus our thinking about anti-racist technology more away from individual people individuals' cognition, the ways that we typically start to approach questions about racism, to think about systems and structures, because systems and structures are the ways in which our systems of racism have been produced today. And so if we are ever going to think about something different, it's going to happen, or going to happen at that same scale, at that same structural level.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you indeed. I've been asked by Apurva to ask the question I see here in the chat, so I'll do that, Charlton. So the question is from Apurva: how do we bring white people into this space to work as allies willing to disrupt their privilege, as it feels like this work is burdened onto the shoulders of Black, Indigenous, and people of color?
That's a great question. Could take up the rest of our time and so much more. I think, first of all, I think we have to, I think I would start by making sure that there's a very specific positionality when we think about allyship. This has a lot to do with the position of scholars in the academy, and you brought up, Tanner, in the introduction, the communication so wide. I think this connects a lot there, which is about leadership and who leads and which voices lead. I think so often, even in the benevolent ways in which folks proceed in wanting to help make change, often still becomes a prerogative of white folks without the voices leading the way of people and communities of color. I think that is certainly the case when we think about technology, technological innovation, design, and so forth, that even when there's a sense of we want to help ameliorate outcomes or problems associated with this that accrue to particular communities of color, we jump quickly to what we know and already a pre-made solution is, without deeply understanding what the context and circumstances are by the very people that we're trying to be allied with and allies of. And so I think in one respect, very simple, being willing to be in a place of listener rather than doer, not being the only or loudest voice in the room to help shape, frame, articulate the circumstances or what's of concern or what priorities are of a given community. I think that's probably in many ways a first and very primary step that I think often is hard for a lot of white allies who, in some dimension, and I think rightly so, in the right moment, can and certainly have privilege and power to exercise that could bear significantly on a given problem or situation. But I think being willing to say, look, I don't have to lead in my actions. I don't have to lead by my privilege and power in a way that overpowers the voices of those who I say I'm trying to ally with, is a first step. I'll give a particular case in point that I think summarizes and characterizes a conversation that I had with a lot of folks over the course of the last year, which is thinking about the pandemic, thinking about the disparate impacts that the pandemic had in so many communities of color, Indigenous communities, Black communities, Latinx communities here in the United States. And then, of course, the move by public health entities, hospitals, health agencies of states and so forth, and aided very much by new technologies that could come to bear in helping to power the recovery and so forth, there was the move to say, look, here's what you need in terms of hardware, software, to make it more likely that people in your community are staying safe, that we know who is affected, who is potentially affected, how to keep folks away from harm, so on and so forth. And that those were quick jumps to fixes that skipped right over what are your needs? What do you want? What are your fears? What's your relationship to this institution of healthcare that makes you hesitant, let's say, to get a vaccine or to think about any number of fixes to the problem? So all this to say is that we don't have, and as I talked with public health folks and friends that were in these circumstances, technologists, data scientists, healthcare workers, and others, all ended up smashing up against this wall, which is we have no significant way of understanding, much less drawing on the voices, the prerogatives, the expertise that's embedded in the communities that we say we are trying to serve and help. And I think while that doesn't give an answer, it does help to describe, I think, the profound problem that we have when we think about anti-racist technology and the question about allyship. And I think it has everything to do with the position of people of color and radically shifting that position with respect to voice, influence, and power in terms of informing how we proceed. It's not a great answer. It's the one I can articulate in this time, but certainly much more to say.
Oh, really appreciate that. Thank you, Charlton. It looks like we have about 6 or 7 minutes to go. And if it's possible to go for another 3, that would be okay. But if not, that's fine too. But I'm just going to then ask Penelope. Penelope has a question.
Thank you for your talk. As you were talking, I was thinking about the first panel that I attended at this Congress, which was a Communications to White panel, on which my colleague Judith Nicholson gave a brilliant paper on mobile technologies, focusing in particular in this instance on the gun as a mobile technology, and a technology that, of course, is one that has been used for purposes of power, as literally and figuratively a weapon of oppression and exploitation, colonization, and so forth. And I was thinking further about new technologies like the mobile telephone and the ability to communicate. So we have these technologies that can cut both ways. That cell phone for Black Lives Matter protesters is simultaneously a tool of surveillance and a tool, and it affords also the possibility of organizing. So I'm wondering if you might talk just a little bit about that double edge of these technologies, where the anti-racist and the racist seem to be sort of coupled and sort of muddied together sometimes, where it's hard to separate them out.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I end up confronting quite a bit, which is this double-edged sword when we think about the affordances, and the same affordances that allowed something like a Black Lives Matter to happen, also allowing and facilitating what happened sort of as part of the status quo with technology in terms of the surveillance, the policing that you mentioned. And I think that's a great example of thinking back to the earlier question about having a different question that animates how we design and build technology, because I think in some ways what happens is those original questions set out the kind of the foundation or the sort of primary use of a given technology, such that that's what is always going to be part of its use, right? So it was no surprise to a lot of us, to a lot of folks, that not too far on in the Black Lives Matter movement and protests, where platforms like Twitter were playing a very central role, that those were overcome by law enforcement in very short order. That's the way technology is meant to work, right? There's always a course correction, even if there's a little bit of a jump where a month or two we're able to organize and to communicate and to amplify voices in a way that really thwart law enforcement, surveillance, the ability to predict where actions are taking place. So there might be that brief period of time, but there's always a course correction where the technology performs and does and affords what it always was supposed to. And I think that has a lot to do with that, the imperatives for which it was first designed. And so I think that one of the things that we have to think about and think about anti-racist technology is not only the questions that animate new technologies or any technologies that we build, but the question about ownership, which I think is significantly tied up within that. The very fact of ownership of a platform like Twitter, as it is, means that it has certain imperatives, that it is permeable to certain institutions and institutional actors in terms of surveillance capability, et cetera, all of which I think make it such that it and things like it will be used as a tool for those things that generally and broadly historically have done harm. And that the ownership model of that requires that type of relationship with these other institutions to flourish and to thrive. And so, an Amazon, while it certainly could, would not be as profitable as if it completely cut all relationships and ties to law enforcement applications of the systems that it builds, let's say. And so I think that our allegiance in terms of ownership, in terms of the way certain technologies are built, forecloses largely on some of these more activist and justice-oriented applications of new technology, and lead back to the sort of affordances for which they were first designed. And so I think we have to not only think about new questions, but also think about new forms of ownership of technologies at the same scale that these others have been designed and proliferated, if we're to radically think about something that looks different.
Thanks so much, Charlton. That's a really, really fine point to, I think, can conclude our keynote session at CCA 2021 with. Back to the bigger question of structures of ownership and control, and how do we go about reconfiguring and redesigning that to then sort of create more space for anti-racist technology. I really appreciate that. On behalf of the Canadian Communication Association, I want to thank you again for joining us today virtually. That was just such a tremendous talk, and we wish we could meet you in person, but in the future, I think we will. And so warm regards. I'm seeing lots of claps to you.
Thank you. Thank you. And when the time is right and Canada's back open, I'll be there and look forward to joining many of you.